Hi everyone, I'm Sophie. Welcome to today's National Teen Book Club broadcast, which I'm co-hosting with Savitri. Thank you so much for joining us. This broadcast will last around 45 minutes and we're starting with an introduction to our guest speaker before we move on to our Q&A. So joining us today is author Ania Poranek, who publishes under A.B. Poranek. Ania grew up in Canada but spent her summers in the Polish countryside. Her love of animals led her to pursue a degree in veterinary medicine, though she's always written. And her first novel, Where the Dark Stands Still, is out now. It's an ode to Poland's wild woodlands, wilder folktales, and the girls who were raised by them. Her latest novel, A Treachery of Swans, is a sapphic retelling of Swan Lake. So this session is the fifth of 6 broadcasts, which are inspired by our hero read for the term, That Selfsame Metal by Brittany N. Williams, and its curriculum linked to William Shakespeare. Just like our hero read, Ania's book, Where the Dark Stands Still, is a fantasy novel with magical elements, and it's also a story that world builds with and pays homage to folklore and heritage. And that's something we can explore further in the Q&A. If you are joining us live, you can submit your questions for Ania by scanning the QR code on screen or by typing the code into slido.com. You can also submit questions via the Q&A function underneath this stream, and you can join in at any time with your questions. If you're experiencing any issues with the stream as well, just let us know in the comments there and we'll try our best to help you.
Right, thanks so much for joining us, Ania. I'm not sure it comes across how beautiful the front cover is as well of your book. I would have been all over that when I was younger, I think. So thank you again for joining us. We are going to start straight away with, please, will you tell us a bit more about your books? We've got Where the Dark Stands Still and A Treachery of Swans. So what are they about?
I haven't had to pitch both of them in a row yet, but Where the Dark Stands Still is a kind of retelling of Beauty and the Beast and a retelling of the Polish myth of the fern flower, and it follows a healer from a small village who has magic powers she can't control and who decides she wants to get rid of them in order to fit in with her village. So she goes into the forest that's on the border of their village, and in search of the fern flower, which is a flower that can grant wishes. What she finds instead is the Leshy, who is this mythological guardian of forests, and he makes her a deal. She works for him for a year, and he will grant her her wish. She gets swept off to his manor, she discovers secrets, and soon realizes that there's more to the bargain than meets the eye. Treachery of Swans is kind of its spiritual cousin in the way that it's also a gothic story. It's very atmospheric, but in this one it's a sapphic Swan Lake retelling following the Black Swan, as she tries to restore magic to her kingdom.
Thank you. And what inspired you to write both of them? I mean, we touched on the Polish countryside and folktales for your first book, but what inspired you for both, and what do you want readers to kind of take away from your books? Any insights or reflections?
They were both, both of them kind of were drawn from my childhood in different ways. Where the Dark Stands Still was kind of an exploration of Polish folklore, as somebody who grew up outside of Poland, but spent a lot of time in Poland, kind of a reconnecting with culture, and also just paying homage to kind of my childhood and having spent so much time in the Polish countryside. All those little things that come there. Treachery, on the other hand, is a reimagining Swan Lake, which was one of my favorite fairy tales growing up. I grew up on the Barbie movie, obviously, as a lot of people did, but I also saw the ballet is one of the first ballets I ever saw. I remember it very fondly, and it's a story that I've just always loved. And the Black Swan especially kind of captivated me. I really wanted to kind of explore her further, because in the ballet she shows up for like 1 second, and that's all you see of her. And she kind of is not really a character in her own right. She's more of a tool, and I really wanted to kind of give her a voice of her own. So that was the inspiration behind Treachery. I think Where the Dark Stands Still, they're both very much coming of age stories about finding your place, but in different ways. In Where the Dark Stands Still, Liska's kind of trying to fit in a space she doesn't belong. She comes from this very small, very, very religious village, and she is told she doesn't fit in there, but she's trying to anyway. It's very much about her accepting that she needs to forge her own place in the world and learning to basically love herself the way she is. And that also is, I'd say almost Treachery of Swans is the opposite, where Odile, the main character, starts out knowing she doesn't belong and being very proud of that. She's very close to being a villain, and Treachery is her redemption story, and it's about trust. It's about her inability to kind of trust the way she's been isolated from everybody else and kind of told herself that she's the villain, And it's about her breaking free of that narrative and learning to trust other people through the friends she makes in the book, and also her love interest. And I think but ultimately they are both stories of belonging in different ways, where Odile finds her place with friends, Liska finds her place outside of the village, encounters in the world she makes for herself.
Thank you. And some important messages there, but also you got to play with magic as part of your story, Where the Dark Stands Still. And magic is very much an element of that self-same metal, our hero read as well. Was it fun to kind of play with that in your story? And what leeway does that give an author for their writing?
It's funny because with Where the Dark Stands Still specifically, the magic system gave me the most trouble, because I very much started off with like a fairy tale magic system where it just does what I need it to do whenever I need it to do it, because it does have rules, but they're quite loose. And I wanted to keep them quite loose because of what the book requires, but also because that I felt added to kind of the fairy tale atmosphere of the book. A lot of fairy tales that we know and stories that we know will just have magic that is kind of unexplained. And that was the vibe I was going for with Where the Dark Stands Still. But ultimately, you do have to do a little bit of world building and a little bit of like organizing your magic system. So I did actually have to find explanations for why things worked the way they did, especially because you're kind of in Liska's head and you need to understand the thought process behind the magic and why it does what it does. So it was a bit tricky because with every draft, I kind of refined the magic system a little bit more. It started off as kind of loosey-goosey, like, oh, it does things. And then my editors being like, hey, we need to understand this, and you'd be like, do you though? And then as it went on, I did kind of refine it to where now it is, I think it's a relatively easy to understand magic system, while still kind of being broad in what it can do and what the characters can do. Yeah, and for Treachery, I did actually I did build a magic system as I was building the book, so that one does actually have like a quite firm, understandable magic system that has limits and rules and things like that, which Where the Dark Stands Still didn't. It's Where the Dark Still is a little bit more free in terms of like the magic system.
It kind of makes sense because part of the background is how it's all wild, and I guess folk tales are not written down, so maybe there's more ambiguity there, right? She says riffing on this without that being part of your thought process. But so interesting what you're saying there about that world building. How important was it, and how did you go about doing research when you're writing a book that explores mythology, folklore, and potentially, I guess, some real places?
Yeah, for Where the Dark Stands Still especially, I have the advantage of speaking Polish, so I was able to go and read papers written in Polish about Polish history and Polish culture. It's set in kind of cusp 19th, 20th century Poland, as it would have been. And so I drew a lot on kind of papers written about that time period, what people kind of like, what the origins of things like folk clothing and the origins of kind of a lot of traditions that we know, the way it kind of links to paganism, but also Catholicism, which is really interesting. There's like an intersection there in the way that they developed, where Catholicism kind of took over. Poland was baptized into Catholicism, and it kind of took over where, they tried to phase out paganism, but it kind of stayed in the folklore and in the culture. And so there's still a lot of traditions that kind of come from there, but have been made into kind of Catholic celebrations, which is really interesting. So a lot of that kind of went into the story. So it was really helpful to kind of read things written from people from Poland who do have a passion and do study these things. It was written in the time of COVID, so a lot of it was done online. I wasn't quite able to go to museums. Towards the end, I was able to go and like look at kind of folk costumes. We also have like a family friend who works with Polish folk dance groups, and she takes care of the costumes, so she was able to kind of like take me and explain the different costumes to me and like what they mean, where they're from, why they developed the way that they did. So it was a lot of like very kind of like whatever I could find, I researched, and I really wanted to kind of give an idea of what the time period was like, while not, I don't strive for historical accuracy as much as I do for like atmosphere. So that was kind of what I wanted to do here as well. I also interviewed my grandparents. I ended up sitting my grandma down and being like, Papcha, what was it like back then? And she was like, well, and she like ended up pulling out photos, like black and white photos of like her like her family and like them in like this old like Polish house. And it was like it was interesting to kind of be able to dive into that. So it all kind of came together in Where the Dark Stands Still.
And how long was that process of doing the research in comparison to the writing? So in our research in advance for this session, we discovered that you wrote the book in 2 or 3 months. Is that correct? And yeah, how long were the different processes? It sounded like you had a lot of research to do.
It was more, I spoke to, oh my goodness, who did well, I had a chance to speak very briefly to Lee Bardugo once, and I asked her this question because she does a lot of research for her books, and I was like, how do you go about this? And she was like, no, you write the book, and then you figure out which areas you need to research, and then you go and research them, which is also what I do as well, is that I kind of write the book first, and I leave brackets in the areas where I'm like, I don't know what this would be like. I did do, there was a little bit of preliminary research just because I had written a book previously to this, which was also based on Slavic mythology. So I had some knowledge going into this already of like, especially the myths. So I already had that in my head and I knew what I was retelling and I knew which kind of creatures I wanted to incorporate. But for the historical bits, it was very much like, as I was writing, I would end up at a place where I had to describe something and I'd be like, okay, what would this look like? How would this have worked? How would, if how would life have looked in that time period? And obviously I was able to take some liberties because Leshy has a magical house and I was like, this house has plumbing. We're not going to think very, very hard about it, but I just want that to have plumbing. So it does. So it was one of those things where I was able to kind of like skirt around the restrictions of the time period with kind of just magic. But it was definitely a lot of like, write the book first and then kind of fill in the gaps with research. So it kind of was as I was writing. There wasn't a specific time period I set aside for it because it's kind of hard to know what you need to know. And then there was a lot of cutting out that happened as well. It was a lot of like me info dumping things that I had learned into the book and then sitting down and going, I love this information, but we don't actually need to know this. And then like crying as I cut it out of the text. So
we've linked this book to Shakespeare through the use of folktales, and Shakespeare also massive reteller of stories borrowed from other cultures, rewritten into to reflect the concerns of his own era. So ancient Rome turns very Elizabethan at various points. Did you study any of his work at school? And if so, how did you look back on it as an experience? So are you a fan or were you put off for life? And are there plays that resonate in particular?
oh, we had a very interesting school in which, because I went to French school. I'm from Canada, and I went to an all French school. So basically, instead of, we did do some Shakespeare in English class, but we did a lot of French plays. We did Molière, we did Cyrano de Bergerac, we did a lot of like those kind of classic French plays instead. We did do some Shakespeare, so I am familiar. I've always enjoyed plays. I love doing them in class. We always read them out loud in class, and that was always a great time. We had a lot of theater kids in our in our year, so I very much enjoyed I've always enjoyed plays. I think it's interesting because like I started to develop more of an interest in Shakespeare as I got older. Once I was kind of out of school and I was able to enjoy them more and like the way they're meant to be performed, which is through actual play as opposed to reading them. Because I always did struggle with reading them. I have like massive issues with focus, so they were always a little bit tricky to read. But having been able to see a lot of them performed, I recently saw Much Ado in London with Tom Hiddleston, which was great. And having been able to kind of like see them in their natural habitat, I do love them. I think they're great. I think they're so classic for a reason. There's a reason we keep coming back to these plays. They're so relatable even today. And I think they're great. I'm not like super passionate about Shakespeare of all the things, but I do very much love to go see a Shakespeare play.
And obviously Shakespeare has a huge legacy. Is that something that you think about for yourself as an author? And your second book, A Treachery of Swans, is kind of a refreshing and a new retelling of Swan Lake. So have you thought about the legacy of stories and retelling for that process, for that writing?
Definitely. I think it's a lot of, I always try to remind myself that like every story has been told before. And a lot of, we say that there's not really anything original, which isn't entirely true, but it's the way that we keep everything, all my stories are retellings, and therefore they're all like a fresh spin on something that already exists on an existing property. But I think a lot of that, like the familiarity of that, the ability of like, reading something that you've already read before in a new way is kind of what makes it new and fresh and exciting. So that kind of legacy is something I think about a lot. I also occasionally, when I write a word down in the text and my editor's like, this isn't a word, I'm like, it is now because Shakespeare made up words, so can I, which doesn't go down very well most of the time. Most of the time they're like, no, this has to go. I'm like, but it sounds good. But no, it's something that I definitely do think about a lot. Especially having like delved so deeply into like fairy tales and folklore, especially when it comes to Slavic folklore and Polish fairy tales, which is something I grew up on, and kind of seeing how that has endured over the years despite a lot of it having come from oral storytelling. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Thank you. So for anyone who's listening who's sort of thinking, oh wow, you wrote your book in 2 to 3 months, that isn't the whole story, is it, though? So we're really interested. We know your love of storytelling started from a really young age, but what was the journey to being published and becoming an author?
Oh man, it was a rough ride, as it is for I think a lot of people. So Where the Dark Still was my third book. I had written 2 before that. The first one was very loosely kind of Slavic-y. It was not great. It's the first full book I'd ever written, but it was the one that I had done research for like in Slavic folklore, so I already had some knowledge of that. And then I put that one aside. I didn't like it at all. I wrote another book. The first one I queried, it didn't go anywhere. The second one, in case anybody doesn't know, querying is the process of seeking an agent. It's when you send a letter of like you send out a small kind of synopsis of your book as well as the first couple of chapters to an agent. You say, hey, do you want to represent me? So that was the first book I queried. I never got any responses. And I somehow kind of knew that was going to be the case, but I wanted to try anyway. Book 2, I finished it and was like, this isn't it. Like, I just didn't love it. And I did query it briefly, but I didn't really try very hard. And then I think it was COVID. I can't remember if I started this book. Yes, it was. It was just after COVID started. And I was sitting in my room and I was texting my friends and I was like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do next because these were the only ideas I had. What am I going to do? And then at some point it hit me in just in like a sudden moment of like a full light bulb moment. And it was, what if you took that first book and you turned it into a horror? And that was the moment that I was kind of like, yes, this is what I'm going to do. And I took that first book and I tore it apart. Barely anything of it is left, but the folklore is there and kind of the idea is still there. And so I restructured that into this book. And I figured out the ending very quickly because that was the horror element that I like really wanted to kind of to flesh out. And so as soon as I knew the ending, I was like, wait, this makes so much sense. A haze of 3 months, and then God bless, not God bless COVID, but like, thank God I had the time, because COVID was awful. But thankfully I had the time to be able to sit there and write that book for 3 months, and with very little to distract me really, because my school they basically gone, okay, it's COVID, everyone go home, and they sent us all home. I was studying in Poland at the time. They sent us back to Canada, well, me back to Canada, but like I sat and I wrote this book in a haze of 3 months, and that's all I did, and I don't remember any of it. Like, I fully have a black hole in my memory when it comes to Where the Dark Stands Still. So yeah, it was kind of very much lightning in a bottle, kind of. It's very rare. Treachery took me about 5 months to write, maybe. And then obviously once you sell a book and you have editors, you do several more passes on that book. So really it takes, I'd say, a minimum of a year to have a fully, properly fleshed out book, if not more than that. Just depending on kind of how fast you write, how well fleshed out your idea is, and how intensely you edit that book afterwards. So it very much varies. But Where the Dark Still was a bit of a special case.
Okay, so you spoke there about having that space and that time due to COVID to write your books, but in a general sense, how do you nurture creativity? And that's so important to so many careers. So how do you keep that spark going, and what advice do you have for our young people?
Honestly, it's a lot of consuming media. It's a lot of reading and a lot of watching movies. Just kind of being aware of the media that's being created around you and letting that inspire you. For Treachery specifically, I watched a lot of old-timey period films, a lot of them in French, just to get kind of an idea of the vibe. Especially for Treachery, I wasn't quite sure what time period I wanted to set it in. And then I ended up just kind of like watching movies and kind of figuring out which kind of time period I liked in terms of what was happening historically, and how that could reflect with the story and how I could blend those two together. But it really is, whenever I start writing a book, I kind of make a list of books that have that either tackle similar topics, are set in similar time periods, or have something else about them that I kind of want to see how other people have done it, draw inspiration, especially if it's like my favorite authors who are amazing, and I am able to kind of just see how they've done it and hope that I can capture a modicum of that in my own writing. So it's a lot of like, I'll sit and I'll read those books, and I'll kind of do this like preparation. I'll do research. Obviously, I think history is a really good place to draw inspiration from, especially when you're building a fantasy world, but you want to ground it in something real. Then it's really good to kind of be familiar with history, to kind of, I like to pick a time period and kind of stick to that, especially like, in terms of like, if I'm describing a room, if I'm describing clothing, food, it's really nice to have a time period to kind of ground yourself in and just kind of have that to research. And yeah, watching a lot of movies. I watch a lot of movies, especially when I'm starting to work on a book. It really does help to just kind of like absorb as much as you can. Also, I find because I write, I'm very visual. I like to have like an idea of aesthetic when I'm writing. I spend a lot of time on Pinterest. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of like building Pinterest boards and being like, yes, this is the aesthetic I want for this character. And that is probably my favorite part of the process when I get to sit around and tell myself I'm working on my book, but really I'm watching movies and on Pinterest. It's a great time. But obviously at some point you do have to like wrap that up and start writing, which unfortunately, but that's I think a really fun moment when I start working on any book, is really kind of learning about what I'm going to be writing about.
I love that. Thank you. And it's so nice. We often come back to how the different forms of storytelling can feed and nurture each other. You know, there's not necessarily a hierarchy, right? Poetry, stories, wherever you're reading them, and music, all of that can feed into that creativity. You touched, and your book is so visual as well. It is such a vivid, magical world. It does feel, I found that for me as an older reader, it reminded me of being young, when you can really lose yourself in the world of a book. So it does that really beautifully. You touched there on reading. So we've got lots of questions about books and stories that have impacted you and meant something to you and your favorite authors. So, but let's maybe start with, is there one book, your desert island book, that you recommend to everybody?
My all-time favorite book is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. That it was one of the main inspirations for Where the Dark Stand Still. A lot of people are familiar with the movie, which is great. I love the Ghibli film, but like the book is on a different level. I find it to be, it's extremely witty. It's hilarious. It's kind of laugh out loud funny, and I just love the way that she builds the characters and their relationship with each other and the tension between them. It's a fantastic book. I would, if I had to be on a desert island and only have one book in hand, I would reread that over and over again. I think it's brilliant. So that's my like top recommendation.
And what genres do you usually read? Do you kind of dip into everything, or are you a fantasy and horror reader, kind of like your book?
I tend to gravitate towards fantasy first. I kind of read whatever I'm writing at the time. So right now I'm working on a YA, I'm reading YA books. If I'm working on an adult, I will be reading adult books. Mainly just because I tend to like absorb the voice of whatever I'm reading. There's an author I can't read whenever I'm writing a book, and that's Brandon Sanderson, who I love. But I can never read him when I'm writing because he writes in such a different writing style to mine that if I read his books, I forget how to write prose, which is it's like a silly phenomenon that I end up having if I read a book that isn't written in a specific way. So when I'm writing, I tend to read a lot of very lyrical books, kind of just learning how other authors use prose to kind of evoke setting and evoke theme. I do kind of read all over the place. I think reading diversely is super important. It's good to read, books that, not just fantasy books, but books kind of from everywhere, from all different perspectives, and knowing having that kind of as, in your head is very helpful to writing, because then you have a lot of places to draw from, and a better understanding of how things work. So I do try to do that as much as possible as well.
Thank you. I mean, meanwhile, at the other end of the scale, apparently you once had a 6-year-long reading slump. So, could you talk to us a little bit about that? And what advice do you have if somebody's feeling the same? Should they feel guilty? And how did you get out of it?
I would say it was less of a slump and more of a, I just didn't have time. I ended up like it was through high school and into university. And that was very much because I went to vet school, and that is a very like study heavy thing to be going into. So I really just could never find the time to read. And I also like, it was just very difficult to balance personal life with anything school at the time. But yeah, I think which I did start reading again during vet school, which is funny. And it became my escape after that, kind of my way to relax after like a full day of classes and labs and things. I think it is tricky because I think a lot of reading slumps come from not being able to find a book that you're enjoying, and that, people, how I get myself out of it is I let myself be a mood reader. I kind of just, if I'm not liking a book, I put it aside and I pick up a different one. Some people will force themselves through a book, and I think that for me, that's often responsible for a lot of my reading slumps, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to pick this book up again, but I need to finish it. And so lately I've been really trying to kind of just allow myself, if I'm not vibing with the book, I put it aside, I pick up a different book. If I'm starting a book and I'm like, man, I'm in the mood for this other book, I pick up that other book instead, which doesn't work for everyone, but I think that works for me in terms of just like allowing myself to go with the flow. Because reading is meant to be enjoyable. You're supposed to be having fun. And I think if you're forcing yourself through something, then, you know, you're missing the point of it. That's obviously for like fantasy and fiction books where you're reading them for entertainment more than you are for, you know, for information or for learning. That's a little bit different, where I would say that, you know, if you're reading a book that's really important and that speaking about like modern day topics, that's, you know, that's worth finishing. Whereas for like, especially if you're reading something fun, like a YA fantasy, or a romantasy or something, then definitely I think just kind of going with the flow of the book is what helps me.
Yeah.
But yeah,
That's really good advice. Thank you. And we wanted to know, what is your favorite thing about reading, but also your favorite thing about being a storyteller? Why do you love your job so much?
You know what, I think it is the escapism. It's the ability to kind of just live through 1,000 different lives and 1,000 different perspectives, and, you know, be exposed to things that I wouldn't be otherwise. You know, I think it really is just the love of kind of creating these worlds and these characters and building, you know, I love to build characters that people can relate to despite them being in outrageous scenarios. You know, most of us aren't going to be living in a manor with a forest demon and, you know, learning magic, but it's still, Liska's struggles are, you know, drawn from my own experience, and they're things that other people might experience. And I think that is what's really special, especially about fantasy, is that you're able to create these scenarios where, you know, somebody shouldn't be able to relate to them, but they can, because you can create metaphor and you can kind of create characters that people can relate to and can understand their struggles and can kind of, you know, it's always a joy when those characters can help somebody through a struggle or help them understand themselves. So that relatability is, I think, what makes it so special.
Thank you. And you touched also on your studying veterinary science. So tell us about other career paths you considered, and what would you be if you weren't a writer?
Oh yeah, I did. So I did finish vet school, and I would definitely probably still be a vet if I hadn't sold my book. Um, I was always kind of steered towards science, to be fair. My parents were a Polish immigrant family, so it's very like, you're going into science. um, you're allowed to be an engineer or like a doctor in a Polish family direction. And I did want it. I love animals. I was a big animal girly. I kept a lot of pets growing up, and I love animals, of like wild animals and domestic, and it was always a passion of mine. And, you know, when you love animals and you're a kid, people tell you to go into vet school. That's kind of the only option they present to you, and that's what thought I had to pursue. Um, and that's what I did. I worked towards that from when I was a kid, and I got into vet school, and I finished vet school in Poland. So that was, and that was, but it was during that I kind of realized, I was about midway through my schooling, where I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to be doing this anymore. Something about this feels off. I'm not enjoying myself. It was a lot of just like the doubts started creeping in, and it was also COVID, which didn't help. It was, it kind of just gave me time to kind of really reflect on and whether or not I actually wanted to be doing it, or if this had been something that I'd like told myself I wanted because everybody else was telling me I should want this. And that was when I started writing, and I started kind of thinking of, you know, I was like, this is, if I do manage to sell a book, it's great, because then I have a book out, and then I can maybe potentially steer my career in a different direction. But if it doesn't sell, you know, I still had a degree in hand, and I would finish, and I would probably be a vet today if I hadn't sold my book. But I was determined. I very much told myself, I was like, I'm going to sell a book, and I was willing to do what it took to get there. So I think it is quite tricky, because I know that a lot of people want to be like, they want to be writers as a career. And while it is a viable career, it's kind of tricky to go into. It's a bit of a risk, because you never know if you're going to make it into that industry. So I think it did help that I had the safety net of having a degree, being able to finish school, and kind of like being like, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, then I still have somewhere to go. But yeah, it was definitely an interesting. Whenever I tell people, they're like, "Oh my God, that has nothing to do with writing," and I'm like, "No, it does not." But I did always love to write. It was something I was doing since I was a kid. I was best at English. It was my top grade always. So very much the signs were there. I just ignored them. But yeah, it's definitely like, it was definitely an interesting kind of way to get into the writing industry. All of my friends who are authors and career authors had very, very different paths to getting in. I don't think there's one way to do it. I think it's very much just whatever works for you.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because we always talk about how careers are not really linear. They can go in many different directions. There could be lots of different opportunities that come your way. What advice do you have for our book clubbers around kind of direction and knowing when to listen to that gut feeling about it's time to change it up or choose another path, and when it's maybe just a challenge, and how they can overcome that? Because obviously all careers and all kind of lives have challenges at some point.
I think it's tricky because I have a bit of a cynical nature where I was like, I need a job. So I very much, which isn't, I think, the best mindset, because honestly, like, I've seen people go into the strangest jobs in the strangest industries, and there's so many industries that nobody tells you about. I think when you're in school, especially in Canada, we weren't really given a lot of options, and you kind of don't even know what's in front of you. And I'm very glad I got to explore that. But I think, yeah, I think it's good to listen to your gut. It's good to kind of look into yourself and say, what do I really want? Because the truth is, and I think this was especially, this isn't the truth for everyone. My brother is very, for example, he's just going to do what he needs to do, and he doesn't really need to feel passionate about his job. He's just going to do his job. And I think it really depends on the person. Whether or not you're content with doing something that might not be your passion, but it's okay, and that's your job. Like, a job doesn't have to be your passion, but I think for me and the way that I'm kind of hardwired, I need to love what I'm doing. I need to be, head over heels with my job. And I think that was kind of the thing that tipped me into realizing I didn't want to be a vet, was that I was, I was almost done school. I had started truly experiencing work, like working as a vet for the first time, and it just wasn't clicking. I just was like, something is off. This isn't quite what I want to be doing. I was always like, I worked as a vet. I worked in a clinic when I graduated, and I was always looking at the clock, waiting until I could go home and go write. And so that was kind of what started pushing me towards, okay, like, I need to reconsider what I'm doing, really look into myself, do a bit of soul searching. And obviously it was a lot more comfortable for me because I had a degree already, so it was kind of like not the biggest risk to take. But I think it is really good to listen to your gut and kind of consider what you want from life, and what will make you happy. And you'd be shocked at how many odd jobs there are and strange things that you can do that nobody really tells you about in the industries that you love. So I think it is really good to just do your research and kind of really use that to help you figure out what you want to be doing. It's hard to give advice on because I've had such a weird path towards it, and it took me a very long time to be doing with my life. But I think that's the thing, is like, there's no time limit. There's no like moment, no one, if you have the luxury, take the time and try to figure out kind of what you really want to be doing.
Thank you. That's some great advice. We're wondering what the best career advice you've ever been given is.
Ooh, it's interesting because I don't think I was ever given any very good career advice. It was very much just, you do this thing and then you'll have a job. To be fair, my parents also being, this is kind of the very kind of immigrant Polish mindset, but they were always like, you need a degree. That was kind of what I was always told. Like, have a degree, have a safety net, have something to back you up, which isn't, I would say that's not great advice. I think that, that's what I was always told. And I do think that there's so many different career paths and so many different things that you can do in life that while it is good to have a safety net, like, I think that that's kind of what misled me for such a long time and stopped from kind of like searching for what I wanted, is because I felt like I needed to force myself into finishing this school that I didn't really want to finish. I would say that I think the best thing that you can do is, like, don't be afraid to change directions when once you're in uni. And if you're really feeling that something isn't for you, there's no shame in changing the direction of the career path you want to take. Sometimes it takes experiencing something to realize you don't want to be doing that. So there's absolutely no shame in changing your mind, and really like following your heart or your gut, or whatever you think is the right direction for you.
That's brilliant advice. Thank you. And obviously, with your book being a fantasy book, we've touched on how you've read fantasy books before. If our young people love fantasy and love your book, what books would you recommend that they read? Have you got any suggestions?
I would say, I'm trying to think of books that are very kind of folklore based. Song of Silver Flame Like Night is one that I read recently by Amelie Wenjiao, and that one also draws on like mythology and folklore, Chinese mythology, and it's a brilliant book, very much about colonialism and fighting against it. And I think that that is a good one to kind of move into if you want more mythology. Um, for slightly older readers, I'd say Uprooted as well, by Naomi Novik, which also is draws on a slightly different part of Polish culture and a slightly different time period, but also deals with Polish folklore and is inspired by that, and also has very much like the haunted forest vibe you're looking for. I would say if you want like a fun gothic-y read that isn't quite as deep potentially, but that is just an enjoyable read, Belladonna by Adeline Grace is also a gothic book. It's very fun. It has a very interesting love interest, and it's just an enjoyable read. It's a good time. It's very moody and atmospheric. I think those are the three that I would kind of say you can branch into from mine. Yeah. I'm like, I have 1,000 books in my head, and they're all like, you know, they're all kind of coming to the surface. I'm trying to pick the ones that are like not, because I also, there's a lot of like adult books that I could recommend, but I think if you do want to move more adult, there's also Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid, and I think that's a really, also like Ava Reid tackles mature topics so well and discusses things like culture and colonialism and those kinds of themes. So that's a good place to move into as well for like a more adult direction.
Thank you. It's so interesting, isn't it, how we can use folk tales and fairy stories to sort of, obviously we get the perhaps the kind of more traditional or the more Disney-fied version, and then they actually have often been really, really dark, and some authors are really delving back in and going back in and putting the stuff that's been taken out for some of the films that are suitable for small children, really, right? And lots of feminist retellings, and as you've done with your book, sapphic retellings. So yeah, there's lots of stuff out there for people to engage with, and if it isn't, then maybe some of the people on this call will write it themselves. So on which note, do you have any advice for young people, or maybe your younger self, around achievements and success? So, what tips do you have for creating a career success story?
Ooh, it's interesting because again, it's just the weird, tricky career path that I've had. I think listening to your gut and your heart is something that I would have told the younger me as well. But it's interesting because I don't ultimately regret the path that I took to discovering what I really wanted to do and like how I really saw myself in the future. I think it is ultimately, I think that's what I would say is like there's no wrong or right time to be kind of choosing or figuring yourself out. Even if you're 2-3 years into a degree, if it's good to follow kind of your heart and what you really want to do and your passions. And that's what I would have told the younger me as well. I think that was very much like I kind of ignored the things that I loved in favor of pursuing science because that's what I was told I needed to do. And there's so many other options out there, and I think it's just really good to explore and really, like what you really want. And I think that's probably what I would say is just be gentle on yourself and allow yourself the time that you need to grow. There's no wrong or right time to be doing that and to be discovering yourself. So
thank you. I think we're coming up to all the time we have left, really. But before we do, any final book recommendations, anything we've not covered that you wish you'd written, or that you're sort of, where are you drawing your next inspiration from in terms of what you might be watching?
Ooh, this is tricky because I've been reading a lot of adult books lately, so I have to think of like slightly more age appropriate ones. Wow, I'm blanking completely. You know what? I'm gonna say Howl's Moving Castle because I think that's a very good book to read, and I think a lot of people haven't read it. A lot of people enjoy the movie and they haven't read the book, and I would highly, highly recommend that book, and also anything else Diana Wynne Jones, because they're very brilliant, very fun, quirky books. Another one that like I had these ready, and now suddenly I don't know any books. I've never read a book in my life.
We always warn everyone, there's too many to remember them. Don't worry, if you've covered everything, you've given us some great titles, and second shout out for Howl's Moving Castle. I think that means you're encouraging everyone to take a look at that if they haven't already.
I will always shout that book out if you give me the opportunity.
It's an amazing, fantastical world. Thank you so much just for letting us squeeze in one more just before we have to wrap things up, because unfortunately that is all we've got time for today. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to our young people about your book and your other reads. And it's been so great to explore all the different, it must be great to be able to read in multiple languages as well. It's brilliant. So a huge thanks to everybody who's tuned in and submitted questions. We really hope you enjoyed this Q&A with Ania. If you're interested in her books, which are beautiful and lyrical and poetic, with really vivid world building. So we will be sharing a feedback form soon by email, and we would really appreciate both students and school staff completing it. If you'd like to share any thoughts in the meantime, please do feel free to do that via the Q&A function or email, and we would love to hear how you found today's broadcast. We hope you can join us for our upcoming and final session for that self-same metal, the finale with the author Brittany N. Williams. So please head to our NTBC webpage for more information and to register any groups.
Yes, that takes place next week, so we hope to see you then. You can also find more broadcasts on the Speakers for Schools website. There's actually lots of creative careers related ones coming up, and if you enjoy our book club sessions, you might be interested in our talk with Jax Thomas, director of Bologna Book Plus and former director of the London Book Fair. So she'll be giving an inspiring behind the scenes look at the global world of publishing, and that takes place on the 30th of June at 2 p.m. Educators can sign up their groups via our website or scan the QR code on the next screen. So join us next week and then join again the following week for that talk with Jax Thomas. Thank you again, Ania. Thank you everyone for joining us and for everyone watching the recording.